Hello and good morning. Thank you so much for joining for today's RoomKeyPMS webinar, taking a look at the Overbooking Limits and Overbooking Calendar tools inside RoomKey. Let's go ahead and get started for today. Bit of an outline of our presentation. We'll start with some introductions, then we'll dive right into the topic and define what are overbooking limits. We'll look at overbooking settings and how to use the overbooking calendar. Then we'll talk about how overbooking affects inventory reporting. We'll mention when you can start using this tool, and then we'll wrap it up with a summary and Q&A today. So for our introductions, my name is Tasha Leclerc. I'm a trainer and implementation specialist with RoomKey. I also have our Director of Customer Experience, Mr. William Tam, joining me today. I'll be leading today's presentation and the demonstrations on screen, and William will oversee the chat and Q&A function. So everyone attending today's live presentation is muted, but if you do have questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and click on the Q&A button. You can ask your question. William will be able to answer in text form, and if there's any questions left over, we can use that for our summary and Q&A at the end as well. A couple more things about today's webinar. It is being recorded. You might have heard that notification at the beginning of the presentation today. That recording will be made available on our public support website. And if you've registered but are not able to attend the full webinar, you will receive a notification when that recording becomes available on our public website, usually within about 24 hours of our recording today. For those of you that are attending the live presentation, you will receive a webinar survey at the end of our presentation. Just a couple of quick questions to gauge how we're doing with these webinar presentations. And if you have any suggestions for future topics, we do really appreciate that feedback as well. So keep an eye out for that at the end of the presentation today. Last thing I want to mention is our next webinar. We are doing a 2-day series. So it'll be over the course of 2 days in September. Day 1 is going to cover the owner's accounting setup. And then day 2, we'll be tackling the monthly procedures that are involved with owner's accounting. Now, this is a specific module for those properties that have owned units within their hotel. So this is sometimes called homeowners accounting, or HOA. Just a little heads up about that coming down the pipeline for next month's webinar presentation. Now, diving right into our topic for today, let's define what are overbooking limits. They are a tool to strategically increase your room inventory and achieve 100% occupancy, that goal of a perfect sell. Now, of course, when you're aiming for this goal, we're looking to mitigate the effects of no-shows or last-minute cancellations and early departures by artificially increasing the availability or guest room availability. So we are artificially inflating that inventory number to help offset any effects that are caused by no-shows, or if you have someone check out early and leave an empty room. Some of the other goals here are to avoid walking a guest due to an unplanned overbooking. So if there was an accidental overbooking, it was not part of the overbooking limits that we'll be looking at today, we're looking to kind of mitigate those factors there. Now, there are some risks involved with using the overbooking limits tool. The first one is it is possible to oversell your inventory. So keeping that in mind, we do recommend that if you're using overbooking limits, that you develop a policy to walk guests to a different hotel. Now, I will show you some other settings that you can use to avoid overselling, same day overselling or last minute overselling on the current day. But it is still vital that your front desk team is aware of how to walk a guest to a different property in the event that the current date is oversold. So if you're a property that does not have any other comparable hotels in the area, you may want to avoid using overbooking limits in those cases, because you would not be able to develop a walk strategy for your guests. The other overbooking risk to consider is when you are using a GDS or RMS rate management software like Ideas or Duetto, you need to consider that there are delays when communicating with those types of interfaces and RoomKey. If you are allowing overbooking to occur and that overbooking inventory is being sent out to your GDS distribution channels or direct connects like Booking.com or Expedia, it is possible for there to be a delay in communicating that inventory out to those GDS providers, as well as receiving inventory messages back from GDS providers or an RMS strategy tool like Ideas. So we do have a tool inside RoomKey called Verify Calendar. It's found in the operations menu, and this will help you to automatically find and resolve any inventory discrepancies. So I do have a RoomKeyPMS database here. I just want to show you where that Verify Calendar tool appears. Here in the operations menu, usually near the bottom of the menu, you'll see Verify Calendar. It is permission-based, so if this does not appear for you in your list, or if it appears grayed out, you do need to enable that permission on your clerk ID. When you select Verify Calendar, it's going to give you a date range, and you can actually customize how far in the future this is going to run. So I'm going to run this through the end of August, so down to the 31st there. And when I click OK, it's automatically going to recount all of my reservations and confirm that that matches what appears on the inventory calendar. So here, the result is a message telling me that the calendar was verified and no changes were needed. If there was a discrepancy, this tool will automatically resolve the discrepancy, and it will tell you that in the message. So the alternate message that you would receive here would let you know that discrepancies were found, they were resolved, and changes were updated successfully. So really great tool to have there to help mitigate that possibility of delays communicating with any third-party interfaces like GDS or RMS tools. Now, considering these risks, the goals and risks of overbooking limits, we do have some recommendations here as we go into our presentation for today. I do recommend that you review all these configuration and operations with the Overbooking Limits tool, and that you develop your own overbooking strategy first before you start using these features. So let's take a deeper dive into the overbooking settings, some of these settings that can help mitigate and influence your overbooking strategy. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the Overbooking Indicator, and this is for the benefit of the front desk team or reservations team, anyone who's making a reservation in RoomKey. What you'll see currently, the default option is that the Overbooking Indicator is enabled, and we actually have this as a permission setting. So the permission setting is not enabled by default, meaning that this is the default setting that everyone would see when they go to book a reservation. Now, what you'll see here is that the indicator itself is this background color on the inventory calendar, on the calendar when you're making a booking. Here for the DQQ room type, I can see that 2 rooms appear in inventory, but the overbooking indicator, this background color, is indicating that that is part of the overbooking limit. You'll notice here below where the EKS room type appears, that appears as 0. Now, if you would like to enable this permission for your clerk, let me just grab RoomKey here. You'll go to System Configuration, Clerks. You'll select the user and click the Permissions tab. And on the right-hand side in the Reservation Management section, you'll see this permission 339, Overbooking Inventory Indicator Off. When you select that permission and give that to the user, you would click Post and then save those changes. So when that permission is enabled or when that's given to the user, instead of seeing that indicator, they will no longer see that background color when they go through to make a reservation. So with the permission, the reservation agent is not aware that they are using overbooking limits or overbooking inventory to book the reservation. You can see here that it appears just like any other inventory for the SK or SQQ room types. There's no distinction for this DQQ, even though it is using that overbooking limit. So that's certainly something to consider how that appears for your reservations team. Another setting that I want to discuss is just to note that by default, properties can be overbooked on the same day by same day arrivals or walk-in reservations. So if you do not want this to happen, you can actually use our cutoff limit. It is found in the property module inside RoomKey. So you'll open up the property module and you're going to navigate to this preferences tab. And right below the preferences tab, we have an overbooking cutoff limit where you can set a number of days to automatically release any overbooking limit within that date range. So for example, this database has an overbooking cutoff limit of 3 days. So if I wanted to make a reservation for an arrival between today and the next 3 days, I know that there are no overbooking limits. Any rooms that I book are using my actual live inventory. If I was to book a reservation for next week, so 7 days in advance, it is possible that I could be using overbooking limits. Those would still be enabled for those future dates outside of that overbooking limit cutoff date. By default, all of the properties will have this limit set to 0, and that's why it does allow same day arrivals and walk-ins to use overbooking limits to overbook your property in those cases. The next setting that I want to take a look at is the property inventory. Now, this is something that you might have already seen when you are using RoomKey or viewing the inventory calendar. The property inventory appears at the top of the list of availability or list of inventory for per room type. So in the two examples here on the left-hand side, that's a guest reservation where we can see the total property inventory at the top. And on the right, that's the inventory calendar where again, you can see the total inventory per date for the property itself. Now, we do have the ability to manage property inventory as it relates to overbooking limits for the room types themselves. And we actually have a couple of options for how to manage these settings. So when I look at property limit setting, this setting is actually found in the property module, very similar to the overbooking cutoff limit we just saw. So when I open up the property module, the first or default option for all RoomKeyPMS databases is that the property sum of room type limits is enabled, meaning that here in the property preferences tab, the checkbox has a check mark in it. So that's showing up here in the little red box. Now, option B is to actually go into the property module and change this preference. You would remove the check mark. And this means that the property sum of room type limits is disabled. So option A, option B. Now, what this means for your property or when you're managing your overbooking limits, when it comes to option A, where the property limits is enabled, this means that the property limit will automatically equal the sum of the room type limits. So when you're looking at your overbooking calendar in this case, this overbooking calculation, what you'll see here is that the property limit in this example is 5. And the reason why it is 5 is because it is the sum of the individual limits for each room type. So for the SQQ room type, I have a limit of 2, the SK is 2, and the DK is 1. So those numbers 2, 2, 1 equal the property limit of 5, which is indicated at the top there. So that is option A and the default option for all properties. If you change to option B, what you'll see is that the property limit does not equal the sum of the room type limits. Instead, you have to manage that limit separately. So again, looking at this overbooking calendar, what you'll see in that OB column is that this number, the property limit, does not equal the summation of the other limits. So even though the SQQ limit is increased to 2, the SK is 2, and the DK is 1, the property limit itself is 2, meaning that regardless of which room type is booked, this setting will only allow a maximum of 2 overbookings to occur. Now that could be 2 of the SQQ rooms, 2 of the SK. It could be any combination of those. So I could have 1 SQQ, 1 SK, and that would equal the property limit of 2. So that would actually affect how I overbook or what room types are being allowed to overbook in those cases. So whether you choose option A or option B, we will go through a couple of scenarios of how that can affect how you are managing these overbooking limits. So now that we've got an overview of the settings that are involved when we are using the overbooking limits, let's take a look at how to actually use these tools in RoomKey. So the first thing that I want to show you is how to access the overbooking calendar. The calendar is used to set up and manage the limits itself. So when you have RoomKey open on your screen there, you're going to go to System Configuration and go to the Overbooking Limits tool at the bottom of the screen, usually a little ways down here. So the overbooking limits will open up as a overbooking calendar module on screen. So this is just a pop-up on screen. I can click and move that around if I wanted to still see what's going on in RoomKey in the background there. Now this calendar, by default, it will show you the current date. You can use the drop-down menu here to jump to a future date, and then that will update the calendar or the view of the overbooking limits in the lower half of the screen. You can also advance week by week using the next button. The other thing that we see in the overbooking calendar, it will note if you have any cutoff day settings. So here it's letting me know that the cutoff date is the current date. That means that in those property settings, that setting is set, the cutoff days is set to 0. So it is possible to overbook using same day or walk-ins in this database. Now for the grid itself, this is very similar to the inventory grid where you can see property limit and a list of your room types listed vertically along the left-hand side, the occupancy per each room type, and the current rate for each room type. The total inventory for each of those room types is also noted here. And then where it differs from the inventory calendar is that instead of showing 1 value per day, it's actually showing you 2 values per date. You've got your actual INV or inventory of real guest rooms inventory. And then you also have your overbooking limits indicated by the OB column. Now this database is under option A, so it does show me my OB column here as well. Very similar to the inventory calendar, any values of your real inventory that are at 0 already, those will be indicated with 0 and will have that red coloring also appear here. So it just makes it, that visual indicator makes it a little easier to understand where your actual inventory is at when you're looking at this overbooking calendar. Now, the tools that we use to manage overbooking limits are the edit mode and insert limits at the bottom. And any changes that we make to the overbooking limits are automatically tracked as part of adjustment history. So anytime you make changes to the overbooking limits, that's automatically tracked here in this tool, and this history does not erase. So when you're looking at adjustment history, you can actually look at past date ranges, and you have the option to choose by when the change was made, so the modified date, or the actual date itself. So if I know that someone's made a change to my overbooking limits for December this year, I could go by overbook date and look at a specific date in my future calendar there to see what changes were made. I don't have any changes in this database, so I'm just going to exit out of there and come back to my calendar. So very easy to access that information here in RoomKey from that system configuration menu. So when you're using the overbooking limits, I want to go through a couple of scenarios first. First, I'm going to deal with a database that has the property sum room type limits enabled. This is option A, and it is the default option for all properties when you first start using overbooking limits. So going back to that database I just had there, let me open up overbooking limits once again. And the first method that I'm going to show you is using the edit mode. Edit mode is great if you wanted to update the overbooking limits for a specific date or a couple of dates. It is using the edit mode checkbox in the bottom left-hand corner. So by default, this calendar is locked, but if I wanted to make changes to the overbooking limits for today, I would click edit mode. And here in the OB column for today's date, I'm going to allot 2 rooms in the SK room category, and I'm going to oversell the SQQ by 2 rooms as well. So you can do that for a single date, or again, I could do it for the next date as well, maybe 2 and 2 for Thursday as well. Once you have entered in your overbooking limits or use this edit mode, you would click post in the bottom right-hand corner, and that is now going to save those changes. You get a little pop-up confirming that that is completed for you. When that's completed, because this database has the property sum of room type limits enabled, it means that the property limit automatically updates for me. So here I can see that the property overbooking limit has updated to 4 for today and tomorrow. That means that I can book up to 2 SK rooms and book another 2 SQQ rooms to achieve my overbooking limit of 4 for the property today and tomorrow. Now, another way to update overbooking limits is to insert limit. From this same database, I've done this for 2 days, today and tomorrow, but if I wanted to update the overbooking limits for SQQ and SK for a larger date range, let's say for the month of September, instead of doing that using the edit mode 1 day at a time, I'm going to use the insert limits button. And this is going to allow me to do that for a larger date range. So in this case, the overbooking limits that I want to increase are for the SQQ room type. So we'll do 2 and 2. And you'll notice that these check marks for updating automatically check for me. At the bottom of the screen, I'm going to select my date range, which is going to start from September 1st and go through all the way to September 30th. Now we offer an extra level of flexibility here when you are applying these overbooking limits. You'll notice that I have the days of the week automatically select for me. If I only wanted to apply this for weekends, I can remove the other days of the week so that this overbooking limit will only apply for the Friday, Saturday, and Sundays within the date range in September. So lots of flexibility there when you're applying the overbooking limits using this insert limits tool. I'm going to keep it simple though, so I'm just going to apply it to all of the days within September, and I'll click the Save button. Again, when you're making these changes, RoomKey is going to confirm when that is successfully updated. So I got that little confirmation window, and I can go ahead and close my insert limits. That does bring me back to this overbooking calendar, but I can check my work if I jump ahead using the date picker here. So if I jump ahead to September, I would now see that my overbooking limits have increased. And I was playing around a little bit earlier in this database, so it actually added to any existing overbooking limits that I've got. So that's why I've got a total of 5 appearing for September 1st. If you look on to September 2nd and beyond, that automatically shows the property limit has increased to 4 because I have allotted an extra 2 rooms in 2 of the room type categories there. So that is what the process looks like, or 2 options that you can use when the property sum of room type limits is enabled. Now let's take a look at another scenario, and this time the property sum of room type limits is going to be disabled in the database. So this is option B that we looked at from the settings earlier. In this case, in your RoomKeyPMS database, you would access the overbooking limits in the same method from the system configuration menu and overbooking limits. This will open up on your screen. And when you go to use edit mode, what you'll notice, let me go ahead and click edit mode here. Not only can you change the overbooking limits for the current day, so I can add in 2 rooms here and 2 rooms to the S2D room type, but you can also set a property limit in this case. So when that setting is disabled, you can actually edit the property limit, this band in green at the very top. So what I'm doing here is telling the system that I want to overbook the property by 2 room type, by 2 reservations, but it could be from either the SK or the S2D room type category. When I click post, I get that confirmation, and I can see those overbooking limit now saved into the calendar directly. So today, if I was to make 1 reservation for SK and 1 reservation for S2D, that would achieve the property limit of 2 overbooking reservations. So that would automatically limit, I would not be able to book a 3rd or 4th, even though I have added those overbooking limits to those specific room types. So that is the edit mode when that setting is disabled. Now, of course, we do also have the ability to use the insert method as well. So let me take a look at that process. Back here in the property, I'm going to click Insert Limits. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did in the previous property. I'm going to add 2 overbooking limits for the month of September. Here, I can see in the Insert Limits that I do also have the ability to affect the property limit. So just like we saw before, I'm going to go ahead and put 2 rooms for my SK and S2D room type, and I'm also going to manage that overbooking limit. Now, one thing to note when it is this method, if you only put 2 rooms, or if you only use your room type overbooking limits, but leave your property limit at 0, this effectively nullifies your SK and S2D overbooking limits, meaning that even though you have 2 rooms in each of these categories available in overbooking, because you've left your property limit at 0, RoomKey will not allow you to overbook the property on those dates. So it is important that if you have this option B setting, that you do be mindful that you need to manage your property limit manually. So I'll go ahead and put 2 in there. I'll do the same date range, September 1st through the end of September, the 30th, and I'll do that for all of the room types there. So we'll go ahead and click Save. Great. I can now close the Insert Limits window, and back here on my Overbooking calendar, I'm just going to jump ahead to September so that I can check my work. Great. So here I am at September 1st, and I can see that those overbooking or OB column has updated for all of those dates in September. And again, I've got a total property limit of 2, but it could be from either the SK or the S2D room types in this example. So a couple different methods for managing those overbooking limits. Another feature of the room type limits when that setting is disabled, option B, is that you do have the ability to recalculate the property limit. So even though the property limit does not automatically update with option B, we can force it or tell RoomKey to recalculate the property limit. So I'm going to open up that database we were just looking at there, the one with option B, the setting disabled, and I want to recalculate the property limit. So for today's date, let me just go back to today here. Instead of having a limit of 2, I want to tell RoomKey to recalculate based off of the room type limits. So to do that, I'm going to click Insert Limits. And for today's date, which is automatically selected at the bottom, I'm going to click Property equals sum of the limits. So when I do that, I have my property or my room type SK is set at 2. The S2D overbooking limit is set at 2. And with this setting here, property equals sum of the limits, I click Save. And now when I look at my calendar, you'll see that my overbooking limit or my property limit automatically updates or it recalculates based off of the limits that I've set for the individual room types. So I've got 2 in each room type for a total of 4 for my property. So a couple of different tools that you can use there depending on if you have option A or option B set up in your property settings. Now that we've seen how you can manage overbooking limits and utilize that in overbooking calendar, I also wanted to show you how these changes do affect your inventory calendar and some of the reports inside RoomKey. So we'll start with the inventory calendar, and I've just indicated here that you can actually access that from F12 on your keyboard. So I've just opened up RoomKey here. Let me just close the overbooking calendar, and I'm going to access the inventory calendar. Like I said, you can click F12 on your keyboard, or you can find it in the operations menu. About halfway down that menu is inventory calendar. When you're looking at your inventory calendar, by default, RoomKey will include any overbooking limits. So that checkbox is automatically selected here for my inventory calendar. So when I'm looking at today's date, I can see the inventory, and this is including overbooking limits. If I remove that checkbox, you'll see that those numbers for today and tomorrow automatically update. It removes those overbooking inventory to show me my actual inventory. Now, the inventory calendar can be printed. You can click the print button in the top right-hand corner, and that will give you the option to generate a CSV file, or when you click no, it will actually give you a print preview. Here we go. What I just wanted to show here was for today and tomorrow, my inventory is higher for the SQQ and the SK room types. Let me just close out of that preview. The other type of reporting that is affected by inventory overbooking limits is your inventory detail report. So just going back to the database here, inside the inventory calendar, not only do you have the ability to print the inventory calendar as its own report, But if you wanted to look at a single date, so for example, today, Wednesday, August 16th, you can click on the date header. So I'm just going to click on that date here, and that will actually generate an inventory detail report for me. So it's going to let me know if I have any reservations and what the status of those are, if I have any block holds, and that could be a wholesaler or it could be groups that are holding blocks of rooms. That information appears on this detail. And then at the bottom of the detail report, you'll have this summary letting you know the total inventory for all rooms, including room type overbooking limits. So here it is, including the overbooking limits and inventory remaining as well. So those numbers are updated, and they are affected depending on how you are managing your inventory booking limits, overbooking limits, pardon me. Now, one little tip that I do have for you, your inventory calendar may also show your rates or prevailing best available rate in this case. So instead of showing just one value in this square, you may see a second value showing a rate or pricing for that room type on that date. If you wanted to see that, or if you don't want to see that, that's actually a setting in your property module. Let me just show you where that is in system configuration. You would select property. Here in the preferences tab, you can click modify in the top right-hand corner. And the second checkbox from the bottom in the bottom left corner says display rates in inventory calendar. You can go ahead and select that checkbox, click post. And then when you access your inventory calendar, you just go ahead and hit F12 this time. You'll see that you have a rate value also appear. It does make this calendar kind of longer, so you might have to use a scroll button on the right-hand side in order to see all of your room types. But that is another customizable or section there if you wanted to make those changes. When you're viewing this with the rates in your inventory calendar, you do still have the checkbox to include or exclude overbooking limits. It'll always include those limits though by default. Excellent. So just heading back to our presentation for today. Now that we've had an opportunity to review a bunch of the settings and features of the overbooking calendar, you may be wondering when you can start using this, and I'm happy to advise that you can get started right away. The Overbooking Limits tool is available to all RoomKeyPMS databases. If you are using an older version of RoomKey, you may need to update to the latest version, and you can do that from our support website. So to wrap up our presentation for today, the overbooking limits in RoomKeyPMS allow you to optimize your availability, balance your risk, and achieve a higher occupancy without sacrificing your guest satisfaction. I'm just going to open up the floor to see if we have any questions for today. Great. So I did have a question that appeared in the Q&A from Corey, just asking if this is available to watch. Yep, this is being recorded, so it will be made available on our support website within 24 hours. Because you've registered for the meeting, you will receive a notification when that becomes available on our support website. I'll just double check the chat here. I think Will's been very diligent to oversee both the chat, excellent, and any questions. Hello. After the webinar, I did receive a follow-up email from an attendee asking how to stop overbooking limits. So I just wanted to include a short video clip here to show you how to do that. So I'm going to open up one of the databases that we were using in the presentation. And here I'm going to go to the overbooking limits from system configuration, overbooking limits. When that opens up on screen, if I want to remove today's overbooking limits, in this case, I would use the edit mode. I would select the overbooking limits and I would change these down to 0. When I click post, that will remove those overbooking limits for today's date. And because this property has the option A, it will also update the property limit. So that ensures that that is at 0 for today's date. If you want to remove overbooking limits for future dates, this time you can use the insert limits. And I'll jump to those dates in September. And if you want to remove any overbooking limits for those dates, what you'll do is actually go through and select the update checkbox for each one of these room types. What this does is actually tells RoomKey that you want to update the overbooking limits within this date range for all room types as reflected here in the overbooking column. So it's going to reset all overbooking limits down to 0. When I click save, that will once again confirm for me. I can check my work by closing that window and using my overbooking calendar to jump to that future date. And here I can see that those overbooking limits have been removed for all room types for all dates in September. Now this is the same if you are using any properties that are set up with option B, where the property limits sum equal to room type limits is disabled. Let me jump over to that database. It is the exact same procedure. So again, you would access the overbooking limits from the system configuration. If you want to remove overbooking limits for today's date, you would use the edit mode. And when you remove these overbooking limits, we'll do the same thing. We'll put the room type limits to 0. But because this is option B, you will also need to change the property limit to 0 and click post. That will update for a single date. And if you want to do it for a range of dates, future dates, like in September, we can click the Insert Limits button. Again, we'll select those dates in September from September 1st through to the 30th. And I'm going to go ahead and click all of these checkboxes in the Update column, including the property limit update, and I want to ensure that that limit is going to 0 for the property. I'll go ahead and click Save in the bottom right-hand corner. That will update for me. I can close my Insert Limits window and verify that information on my overbooking calendar. Let me go ahead and jump to September 1st, and you'll see that the overbooking limits are now updated to 0 for all room types, including the property limit for all dates in September. So it does look like there are no more outstanding questions. So thank you everyone for your time today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a great one.